The morning sun spilled across the cobbled streets of Rome, glinting against the white stones of temples and the dusty red of tiled roofs. Vendors had already begun shouting, hawking olives, figs, and honeyed wine. But today the loudest voices came not from the food stalls, but from the marketplace at the edge of the Forum. It was a market unlike the others, a market where human beings were sold. The Roman slave market had no official name. To the locals, it was simply the place. Everyone knew where it was, everyone knew what it offered. You could buy a cook, a tutor, a farmhand, a prostitute, or a gladiator, all with a handshake, a sealed tablet, and a pouch of coins. Slavery was not an unusual institution in Rome. It was the backbone of the empire itself. By some estimates, nearly 1 in 3 people in Italy during the height of the Republic were slaves. For Romans, the idea that a person could be bought and sold was as ordinary as buying a loaf of bread. The marketplace was loud, crowded, and strangely theatrical. A wooden platform had been erected in the center, stained with age and weather. Slaves were led onto it, one after another, displayed like merchandise. Around their necks hung placards written in chalk, describing their origin, their skills, and often their defects. Healthy, age 20, from Cappadocia, knows farming. Or Greek, educated, literate in Homer, price high. Sometimes the boards were more honest. Tends to run away. Whip marks healed. Bidders stood close, inspecting the stock. A wealthy senator might send his steward forward to touch the arms of a potential farmhand, flexing the muscles, checking for strength. A matron draped in fine linen might lean in to inspect the teeth of a young girl, the way one inspects a horse. A merchant might check the eyes of a boy, making sure he wasn't blind. It was all done in daylight, all done in public, without shame. And above them all was the auctioneer, voice booming like a stage actor. 3,000 sesterces for the Greek tutor. Educated, speaks both Latin and Greek, good with children, who will give me more? The crowd murmured, calculating silently. 3,000 sesterces was more than the annual wage of a Roman soldier. But to a rich household, having an educated Greek slave was worth the expense. It wasn't just about utility, it was about prestige. To own a Greek philosopher as a tutor for your children was a sign of status, a reminder to guests that your household was cultured and refined. Prices varied wildly. A common farmhand could be purchased for as little as 500 sesterces, sometimes even less if they were old or injured. A young child might fetch 200, but an attractive concubine, trained in music or dance, could rise to 20,000 sesterces. Exceptional gladiators, those who had already made a name in the arena, were known to sell for sums beyond imagination, more expensive than entire estates. Yet for all these numbers, for all the talk of cost and value, the truth was brutal. Slaves were stripped of identity. They were commodities. A man captured in war could, in a single moment, lose his name, his family, and his freedom. In the eyes of Roman law, he was no longer a person. He was property. The marketplace itself smelled of sweat, dust, and iron coins. Chains clinked softly as slaves shifted nervously on the platform. Some tried to stand tall, hoping to appear stronger, more useful. Others hung their heads, resigned to whatever fate awaited them. A few cried silently. Most did not dare. A crying slave might be seen as weak, lowering his value. One Roman writer, Seneca, once described the market in chilling simplicity. We buy slaves like cattle, weighing their usefulness, not their souls. That was the reality. Rome's greatness, its armies, its monuments, its luxury, all were built upon the backs of people bought here, in places like this. There was a strange rhythm to the auctions. The auctioneer raised a hand, the crowd murmured, the steward lifted a pouch of coins, and suddenly a life was sold. The slave was led away, perhaps to a kitchen, perhaps to a villa, perhaps to a quarry where he would never again see the light of freedom. To Romans, this was commerce. To the slaves, it was the end of one life and the reluctant beginning of another. What makes the Roman marketplace so haunting is its ordinariness. It was not hidden, not ashamed. Children walked past and watched. senators strolled through. It was woven into the fabric of the city. Rome would not have functioned without it. Historians often call Rome a slave society, meaning slavery was not just present, it was central. Every road, every aqueduct, every field of wheat was touched by enslaved hands. And yet, even in this place of buying and selling, there were glimmers of something human. A master might see in a slave not only a tool, but a potential confidant. A boy bought as a servant might, over years, become part of a household. A girl purchased as a maid might later be freed, becoming a Roman citizen and marrying into society. Freedom was not common, but it was possible. The slave market was not always the end of the story. Sometimes it was the beginning of a new, if painful, journey. Still, the first step was always the same. The wooden platform, the auctioneer's cry, and the rattle of coins. The Roman marketplace was where destinies were broken and rewritten, not by gods, but by silver and gold. To walk there, to watch the auctions, was to see the empire's true engine laid bare. Not the Senate, not the legions, but the trade in human lives. By the time the sun began to sink, the marketplace would be nearly empty. The platforms cleared, the buyers gone, the slaves led away to their new masters. Tomorrow, it would all begin again. Another shipment would arrive from the provinces, more captives from war, more children sold by desperate parents, more bodies turned into property. The cycle was endless, and Rome thrived on it. The question then is not simply how much did Roman slaves cost. The question is what those prices meant. Behind each number was a human being. Behind each coin was a life, reduced to a figure. Rome may have counted its slaves in sesterces, but history remembers them in silence, in chains, and in stories that we are only beginning to tell. The Roman market had grown louder as the day wore on. By midday the dust hung heavy in the air, stirred by sandals and hooves, while the scent of sweat and olive oil clung to the crowd. On the wooden auction block, another figure was brought forward. Not a grown man or woman this time, but a child. He could not have been more than 8 years old. His eyes were wide, his tunic too big for his thin shoulders, and in his hands he clutched a small clay figurine, the last remnant of whatever life he once knew. The auctioneer's tone shifted when he announced a child. There was no booming emphasis on muscles or skills. Instead, his words were practical, almost casual. Healthy boy, Cappadocian stock, teeth intact, strong for his age, no simple farm chores. Starting price 200 sesterces. For perspective, 200 sesterces was not a fortune. A Roman soldier might earn that in a few months. To a wealthy Roman, it was little more than pocket change. And yet that sum represented the child's entire value in the eyes of the law. A living, breathing soul, priced no higher than a mule. Why would Romans buy children? The answer was cruel, but simple. Longevity. A boy of 8 could be raised to serve for decades. He could be shaped, trained, molded into the exact kind of servant his master desired. Unlike older slaves, a child had not yet developed habits, resistance, or pride. To Roman buyers, children were not only affordable, they were an investment. The bidding was quick. A matron with carefully braided hair lifted her hand. Her husband whispered something, counting coins in his palm. Across the crowd, a farmer raised his voice, hoping to win the boy for his fields. The child shifted nervously on the platform, clutching his figurine tighter. His eyes darted, searching the crowd for something, perhaps a familiar face, perhaps hope. But no one came for him. The boy had likely been captured far from Rome. Perhaps his village had been taken in one of the empire's endless border wars. Soldiers, after looting, would round up survivors, men, women, and children alike. Adults were marched away, shackled. Children too young to resist were bundled together, crying. They were cargo now, destined for Roman markets. Weeks, sometimes months, they traveled in caravans or ships. Many did not survive the journey. Those who did were paraded here, to stand beneath the Roman sun and wait for strangers to decide their worth. At last, the auctioneer's hammer struck wood. The boy was sold for 250 sesterces to the matron and her husband. A steward stepped forward, took the figurine from the boy's hand, and pressed a lead tag around his neck. On it was scratched his new master's name. In that single moment, his old identity, his family name, his homeland, was gone. He was now property. For the child, the path ahead was uncertain. If he was lucky, his new household might treat him gently. Some Roman families raised child slaves alongside their own children, especially if they were meant to be household servants or tutors later in life. He might be given food, clothing, even an education, though always with the reminder that he belonged to someone else. But if he was not lucky, his fate could be grim. Many child slaves were sent to farms or mines, where their small bodies were forced into harsh labor. Some were trained as entertainers, singing or dancing for their master's pleasure. Others became attendants in the bathhouses, serving water or oil to strangers. And though rarely spoken of openly, many young slaves were used in ways far darker, victims of exploitation by those who held absolute power over them. The Romans rarely saw this as cruelty. To them, it was practical economics. Children were cheaper, easier to control, and could serve longer. They were seen as blank slates, tools to be shaped, not individuals with pasts or futures of their own. Roman writers did at times notice the tragedy. The philosopher Seneca once reflected that every slave, even a child, laughs, cries, and bleeds as we do. But such voices were rare. Most Romans accepted the system without question. The empire's greatness, after all, depended on it. The child in the marketplace had no choice. As he was led away, his clay figurine was left behind, discarded like worthless stone. He did not cry aloud, though his eyes glistened in the sunlight. For him, this was the end of one life and the unwilling start of another. And yet, in the quiet of history, there is a haunting truth. Many children like him endured. Some grew up to find kindness in unexpected places. Some, through loyalty or skill, were eventually freed by their masters. A few even rose to wealth and influence, becoming freedmen who shaped Roman society. But for most, the chains placed upon them in childhood never truly lifted. The sale of children was not rare, it was ordinary. Roman households often had one or two child slaves, especially among the wealthier classes. They fetched lower prices than adults, but were far from worthless. For every child sold, Rome gained another servant, another pair of hands to sustain its vast machine. The marketplace continued as always. After the boy was led away, another child was brought forward. A girl this time, her hair tied with string, her eyes staring blankly at the crowd. Her price would be slightly higher, perhaps 300 or 400 sesterces, especially if she was considered pretty. A young girl could be trained as a maid, a seamstress, or something far more troubling. Buyers would whisper, their eyes coldly calculating her future. By sunset, the platform would be cleared, the coins counted, and the children gone. They would be scattered across the city, their voices swallowed by Rome's endless noise. To the Romans, it was simply business. To the children, it was everything. The loss of family, the theft of freedom, the reshaping of life itself. When we ask today, how much did Roman slaves cost? The numbers, 200, 300, 500 sesterces, seem clear, even neat. But behind every coin was a child with a face, a story, and a future stolen. Their prices may have been written in chalk on placards, but their worth was beyond any number Rome could inscribe. The Roman marketplace ended that boy's childhood the moment the hammer struck. And history, if we listen closely, still echoes with the silence of children like him. Bought, sold, forgotten, yet never entirely erased. The Roman slave market was not only a place of misery and chains, it was also a theater of status. For every child sold cheaply, for every field hand bought in bulk, there were others who stood upon the platform with a different kind of value. These were not bodies for labor or lives meant for quarries. These were minds, skilled, educated, cultivated. And in Rome, those minds came at a price far greater than most could imagine. When a Greek slave was led onto the wooden platform, the crowd shifted. Conversations lowered, buyers leaned closer. For centuries, Rome had admired Greek culture, Greek philosophy, Greek art, Greek literature, they were seen as the height of civilization. To own a Greek artisan, a teacher, or a physician was not merely convenient, it was a mark of distinction, a sign that your household belonged to the educated elite. The auctioneer's tone changed accordingly. His voice rang with drama, like an actor at the theater. "Here we have a man of Athens," he proclaimed, gesturing to the slave beside him. The man stood tall, his beard trimmed neatly, his eyes calm though shadowed with humiliation. Around his neck hung a placard. Educated, fluent in Greek and Latin, skilled in mathematics, rhetoric, and astronomy, literate in Homer, Plato, and Aristotle. The auctioneer did not need to exaggerate. The skills spoke for themselves. A common farmhand might cost 500 sesterces, a child perhaps 200. But this man, this Greek teacher, would not be sold for less than 8,000. Some in the crowd whispered it could rise to 12,000, more than many Roman villas were worth. For the buyers, the calculation was not only about usefulness. A tutor like this would shape their sons, preparing them for careers in politics or law. His knowledge would become theirs by proxy. To invite guests into your home and have them hear your Greek slave quoting Homer or debating Cicero was a luxury beyond gold. It was prestige carved into human form. The bidding began quickly. A wealthy senator's steward raised his hand. A merchant from Ostia called out higher. A noblewoman's brother stepped forward, naming a price with quiet confidence. Coins clinked, voices rose, and the value of the man climbed like the steps of the Capitoline Hill. The Greek stood silently, expression unreadable. He had once perhaps been a free man, teaching in Athens, reading beneath olive trees, walking the same streets as philosophers before him. But war had changed his fate. Maybe he had been captured in a raid, or sold into debt slavery. Now, stripped of name and freedom, he was merchandise. Yet still, in some cruel twist, his mind made him valuable. In Roman law, slaves were property. But in practice, a slave of such intelligence could wield quiet power. Many Greek tutors became trusted advisors, even friends to their masters. Some managed estates. Others whispered counsel in politics. A few, after years of service, were freed and continued to teach as respected freedmen. But until that day came, if it ever did, their brilliance served only as another measure of profit. The auctioneer's hammer struck at last. 11,000 sesterces, sold. The senator's steward stepped forward, clasped the man by the arm, and led him away into a life that would be half servitude, half scholarship. He would live in a fine house, eat better food than many free peasants, perhaps even teach children who would grow to hold power. Yet every morning he would wake not as a citizen, but as a possession. The market soon brought forward another artisan, this time a craftsman from the eastern provinces. His placard read, "Stoneworker, skilled in mosaic and sculpture, trained in marble cutting." His arms bore the strength of years at the quarry, but his fingers were precise, delicate. Such a man could decorate villas, carve fountains, or lay the intricate mosaics that dazzled Roman floors. His price too would climb, though not as high as the Greek scholars. Perhaps 4,000 or 5,000 sesterces, still a fortune compared to common laborers. What made artisans so valuable was their rarity. A strong back was easy to find. War produced captives by the thousands, but an educated mind, a trained hand, those were treasures. Rome thrived on conquest, but it was Greek culture that polished Rome's pride. Every column, every painted fresco, every public statue bore the silent labor of enslaved artisans. The empire's grandeur was carved not only in stone, but in stolen skill. For the slaves themselves, value was a double-edged sword. To be expensive meant you were less likely to be wasted. Masters protected investments. A tutor was not beaten into the fields. An artisan was not thrown into the mines. Yet the chains of ownership still weighed the same. To be valued highly did not mean to be free. It only meant you were a jewel in another man's treasury. One Roman writer, Pliny the Elder, once marveled at a sculptor's talent and admitted he could never understand how such genius could be enslaved. Yet that was the paradox of Rome. Brilliance was prized, but never liberated from commerce. Even the mind could have a price tag. As the sun dipped lower, the artisans were led away, their futures sealed in contracts and coins. Some would live lives of relative comfort, teaching, building, shaping the very world of Rome. Others would remain unseen, their masterpieces credited to their masters, their names erased from history. The marketplace returned to its rhythm. After the artisans came the farm hands, the cooks, the children. But for a moment, those who watched the Greek scholar on the platform could not ignore the irony. Here was a man who could recite Aristotle by heart, who could explain the movements of the stars, who could teach a Roman boy how to speak with wisdom. And yet, he could not speak for his own freedom. And that was the cruel heart of it. Rome knew the value of knowledge, the worth of skill, the brilliance of Greece, but it never stopped to ask whether such value belonged to the men themselves. In the Roman marketplace, even genius had a price. If the Roman marketplace had a spectacle, it was not the sale of children or farmers, it was the sale of gladiators. Nothing stirred the crowd like the sight of men destined for the arena. Rome's appetite for blood and entertainment was insatiable, and the gladiators were its living currency. They were warriors, celebrities, investments, and their price reflected all of it. On a bright afternoon, the auctioneer's voice rose above the clamor. A Thracian fighter, strong, trained, undefeated in 4 bouts. Look at his arms, his scars, his fire. The man on the platform was bare-chested, his body gleaming with oil to show the cut of his muscles. Across his forearms were the marks of past battles. He stood tall, shoulders broad, eyes burning with a mix of defiance and humiliation. He was no ordinary slave. He was an athlete of death. The crowd surged closer. Wealthy Romans did not simply see a fighter, they saw potential profit. Gladiators were trained in specialized schools called ludi, run by lanistae, managers who bought, trained, and sold fighters like prize horses. A strong gladiator could earn his owner enormous sums in betting and performance fees. Victories meant fame, and fame meant money. The cost of such a man was not measured in labor, but in spectacle. Prices soared accordingly. A novice fighter might cost 2,000 sesterces, a seasoned one 6,000 or more. But a champion, an undefeated gladiator who had captured the crowd's imagination, could sell for 15,000, even 20,000 sesterces. To put it in perspective, that was the price of a luxury villa or a small estate. To own such a man was like owning a living fortune. The Thracian on the platform embodied that. The auctioneer called out his record: 4 wins, no defeats, and the bidding ignited. Merchants raised their hands. A senator's agent spoke numbers in quick succession. Even a representative from a distant provincial arena offered a sum, hoping to take the fighter to crowds far from Rome. The price climbed higher with each call, the gladiator standing silent through it all, his jaw clenched, his eyes fixed somewhere beyond the crowd, as if imagining himself back in the dust of the arena. What made gladiators so unique in Rome was their paradoxical status. They were slaves, yet they could be adored like heroes. Crowds cheered their names, painted their faces on walls, and shouted for them in the Colosseum. Women left them love notes, sometimes even offering themselves as mistresses. In the arena, they were celebrated. In the market, they were bought like cattle. Their lives swung between glory and degradation, chained together by price. The Thracian was finally sold for 12,000 sesterces, a staggering amount, enough to buy a farm with dozens of laborers. His new owner, a wealthy Roman who managed games in the provinces, would place him in a ludus to train further, sharpening him into a weapon for the crowd's delight. Every victory he won would increase his worth. Every scar would tell a story, but every defeat carried the risk of ending the investment forever. Not all gladiators fetched such sums. Many were criminals, condemned to the arena as punishment. Their prices were lower, sometimes little more than 500 sesterces, for they were expected to die quickly. Others were war captives, chosen for their strength and thrown into training schools, whether they wanted to fight or not. Some never survived long enough to justify their cost. Yet even here, economics ruled. A lanista had to calculate carefully. how much to pay for a man, how long he might live, how much profit he might bring. To lose a fighter too quickly was to lose an investment. To buy one cheaply, but see him rise in fame, was fortune beyond expectation. In many ways, gladiators were Rome's most dangerous gamble, living dice rolled in the sand of the amphitheater. The marketplace treated them like prize animals. Their bodies were inspected, their muscles flexed, their scars examined like trophies. Buyers wanted to know, was he strong enough to wield a gladius? Did he move with speed? Could he endure wounds without faltering? These questions were not about the man's soul, but his entertainment value. To the crowd, to the buyers, his body was an asset, his blood an investment. And yet, for all the brutality, gladiators held one thing other slaves rarely did: a path, however slim, to freedom. A fighter who survived long enough, who earned enough victories, could be granted a wooden sword, the rudis, a symbol of liberation. Freed gladiators sometimes went on to train others, or even live in modest comfort. Some chose to keep fighting for money and fame. For most slaves, freedom was a distant dream. For gladiators it was at least imaginable, however bloody the road to it. The Thracian knew this as he was led from the platform. The weight of his price hung heavy, but so too did the possibility that one day, through skill and survival, he might carve his way out of chains. His master would demand victories. The crowd would demand blood. But each fight, each cheer, each coin tossed into the arena was another step toward the slim hope of freedom. As the marketplace cleared that evening, the stories of gladiators lingered. Their prices shocked, their fates fascinated, their lives captivated the Roman imagination. Rome loved them not because they were slaves, but because they embodied the empire's hunger for power, struggle, and spectacle. To ask, how much did a gladiator cost, is to glimpse that hunger in numbers. Thousands of sesterces for a man whose life could end in a single stroke of a sword. Thousands of coins for a body that might fall tomorrow. And yet the Romans paid eagerly, knowing the return was not measured in years of labor, but in the roar of the crowd and the spilling of blood. The gladiator was, in the end, the most expensive contradiction of all, worth more than many free men, yet still not his own. His body was his master's property, but his legend belonged to Rome. At dawn in a fine Roman townhouse, the first sounds were not birds or carts in the street, but the quiet choreography of servants. Before any master stirred, the ostiarius, the doorkeeper, swept the threshold and polished the bronze studs. A lanternarius trimmed the lamps and checked the oil. Somewhere deeper inside, a cocus, the cook, tested the heat of charcoal with a practiced palm and breathed in the faint sweetness of fig smoke. All of this happened in a hush, as if the house itself were taking a breath before Rome's day began. If the slave market was the engine of supply, the Roman domus was the place where human purchase became daily life. In these corridors, slavery did not shout. It whispered. It was the smooth change of sandals, the silent glide of a curtain, the cup of watered wine set down before it was asked for. Domestic slaves were the invisible gears that made status visible. Prices here were a language of trust. A common household attendant, young, healthy, unskilled, might be had for several hundred sesterces, sometimes just under 1,000 if fortune smiled on the buyer. But the moment skill entered the room, numbers rose like steam from a stew pot. A trained cook, the pride of any ambitious household, could cost several thousand sesterces. A truly exceptional cocus, one who knew how to coax pepper into sweetness, or to poach dormice so their skins stayed crisp, might fetch a sum that made guests blink when they heard it. Romans loved to boast about their food, and they boasted loudest with coins. The cook was only the opening act in the domestic theater. The ornatrix, the mistress's hairdresser, stood behind her chair every morning, fingers moving like birds through tresses, braiding, pinning, stacking curls into towers, threading gold wire through braids. Fashion changed with emperors and empresses, and a clever ornatrix could keep pace. Such finesse had a price. Masters paid for hands that never fumbled. A dropped pin at the wrong moment could prick not only skin but pride, and pride was always the most expensive thing in Rome. Near the atrium, the atriensis, chief house steward, kept the household accounts. He was the rhythm keeper, the one who knew which amphorae were running low and which guests were prone to spilling wine. He might be literate, numerate, and frighteningly organized. A master who wanted dinners to come out hot, linens laundered and folded, and rumors filtered before they reached the mistress's ear, would pay more for such a man. Thousands more. Trust and competence do not come cheap in any age. Then there were the nurses, the nutrices, who took infants in their arms and through habit and humming, taught them to sleep. Roman families often placed their children first in the arms of enslaved women, who fed them, changed them, and soothed their fevers. Years later, the grown child might still run to that same woman for comfort after a scolding from father or a heartbreak from love. What is the price of familiarity, of a voice that can quiet a shaking child at midnight? In the market ledger, it might be 1,000 or 2. More if she came recommended from a noble house. In the human ledger, it was beyond counting. The quietest power in the house often belonged to the cubicularius, the bedroom attendant, the personal valet. He dressed his master, knew where the ring had been tucked, which cloak was for business and which for grief, which pair of sandals would not squeak on polished floors. He heard secrets muttered in sleep and arguments swallowed at dawn. Prices for such men reflected the weight of their discretion. A valet who kept his eyes on the sandals and his ears in his pocket might be worth twice what his hands alone suggested. Not every role gleamed. Some servants were near invisible. The water carrier with the thickened shoulder from years of jars, the balneater who heated bath water and scrubbed stone benches, the boy who chased smoke from braziers, the girl who gathered rose petals after feasts so the room would not smell of sour wine. Their prices hovered near the base of the domestic pyramid, affordable, interchangeable, easy to replace. And yet, remove any single piece, and the illusion of effortless luxury faltered. The domus was a machine built of many cogs. The smallest still turned the largest. Households arranged themselves like legions. A great man's city residence might have dozens, even hundreds of slaves. Porters, pages, table servants, ministry, readers for afternoon recitations, a pharmacopoeia who mixed ointments, a seamstress who rescued tunics from torn hems, a librarian to mine scrolls that smelled of glue and sea. Each specialty nudged the price upward. A reader with a golden voice could bring tears to guests' eyes with Virgil. A librarian who could mend papyrus without visible seams could save a small fortune in books. Both talents bought dear. But price didn't only follow skill, it followed proximity. The closer a servant's hands came to the master's face, the higher the sum. Proximity meant opportunity, for influence, for betrayal, for theft, and masters paid to reduce risk. A trusted cupbearer, the one who poured wine and, by custom, tasted first, might be worth a premium few would admit openly. Poison is always a line item, even when never spoken aloud. In such houses, discipline wore many faces. A small mistake might earn a sharp word, a larger one the lash, but expensive slaves, especially cooks and stewards, were spared the worst. Investments were protected. A hand that could fillet a mullet into silk was rarely beaten into stupidity. Instead, the punishment might be a cut in rations, a colder room, the silent exile of a master's eyes. Cheap labor could be replaced. Cultivated skill was guarded like silver. And still, comfort was not freedom. Domestic slaves slept in alcoves, storerooms, narrow cells by the kitchen's warm wall. They rose before dawn and fell into straw after midnight. On feast days, they rushed more, not less. They laughed, in kitchens and under stairwells, in a language of glances and quick jokes, building tiny islands of self in a sea of duty. Some had lovers and secret friendships, little rebellions of tenderness in a system designed to turn people into tools. There were paths that curved toward daylight. A house slave might be granted peculium, a personal fund, tips from guests, a quiet portion of market errands. Over years, coins gathered. With patience and favor, a master might accept a buyout, set the slave free as a libertus or liberta. Freedmen of great houses often stayed near, managing the very rooms where they once obeyed. freedom did not undo memory. It threaded through it, like gold through a braid. From the street, a Roman townhouse displayed order, a clean threshold, a fountain whispering in the atrium, a table gleaming under the eye of the household gods. Inside, the order was manufactured minute by people whose prices had once been argued under a hot sun. Ask a master the cost of his comfort, and he might quote the cook's purchase price, the stewards, the hairdressers. Ask the kitchen maid, and she would answer with fingers scarred by boiling oil and a back curved by years of leaning over glow and smoke. The arithmetic of the domestic sphere was never only coins. It was the arithmetic of attention. How many steps it took to cross the peristyle with a tray balanced, how many breaths between a mistress's sigh and the curtain pulled, how many evenings a reader could lift a faltering dinner with a tale before the guests noticed the fish was oversalted. Prices suggested numbers, life supplied the rest. By late afternoon, a household brimmed with motion no guest fully saw, a jug swap. If the Domus was the theater of Rome's luxury, the countryside was the empire's furnace. Grain-fed legions, olives filled amphorae, grapes sweetened wine, and behind all of it were slaves who worked the vast estates known as latifundia. These estates stretched across Italy and the provinces like carpets of green. From a distance, they looked idyllic, orderly rows of vines curling under the sun, wheat fields swaying like golden seas, olive groves stretching to the horizon. But step closer, and you would hear the crack of the overseer's whip, the groan of oxen, the rustle of hundreds of human bodies bent under the weight of harvest. Farm slaves were the cheapest, and in many ways, the most expendable of all. In the city, a cook or tutor might fetch thousands of sesterces. In the countryside, buyers spoke of numbers in bulk. 10 men from Gaul, strong enough for reaping. 5 women from Thrace, good for pressing grapes. Prices here fell to as low as 300 or 400 sesterces each. Sometimes entire groups were sold together at discount, the way one might buy tools. To a landowner, the arithmetic was cold but simple. The bigger the estate, the more hands it needed. Men for plowing, women for threshing, children for gathering kindling and chasing birds from fields. A broken tool could be replaced, a dead ox could be bought again, and so too, a slave. Economists of the empire wrote about this with the detachment of accountants. Invest not too dearly in farm slaves, for they wear quickly. The work itself was relentless. In spring, men drove wooden plows through thick soil, sometimes yoked to the plow themselves when oxen failed. In summer, under a punishing sun, they reaped grain with sickles until their hands bled. Autumn brought the grape harvest, feet purpled by pressing, backs bent under baskets. Winter was no reprieve. Trees needed pruning, fences mending, ditches cleared before rains turned them to swamps. Overseers, often freedmen loyal to the master, carried staves and whips. They shouted orders, tallied quotas, punished slackers. A slave who faltered from exhaustion might be beaten back to work or chained overnight as warning. Escape was nearly impossible. The estates sprawled too wide, and villages nearby knew better than to shelter runaways. Branded foreheads, iron collars, and hunting dogs made the system airtight. The barracks where farm slaves slept were crude. Rows of straw mats on the dirt floor, smoke from a single fire curling against the rafters, a sour smell of sweat and damp wool. Food was basic: coarse bread, porridge of barley, sometimes beans or cabbage. Wine was watered, meat rare. Slaves often tended the master's animals better than themselves, for an ox represented wealth, while a man could be replaced with coin. And yet, life on the latifundia was not entirely without rhythm or meaning. Among the slaves, bonds formed. Songs rose in the fields, echoing from one row to another. Old men told children stories of homelands they barely remembered. Women patched tunics with care, traded herbs for fevers, whispered comfort to those broken by lash or grief. In these small acts, humanity flickered, even in the empire's harshest corners. Some landowners believed cruelty was wasteful. The agricultural writer Columella advised, "Treat slaves with fairness, for a contented worker is a productive one." He recommended modest rewards, extra rations, a day of rest, the promise of peculium, personal savings. But many ignored his words. In an economy where grain meant survival for the legions and profit for the master, efficiency outweighed mercy. The whip was faster than kindness. Rebellions simmered here too. It was from the countryside, not the city, that the great slave uprisings erupted. Spartacus himself had once been trained as a gladiator, but many of his followers came from farms, men hardened by toil, furious at chains. The latifundia produced food for Rome, but also anger. Every harvest carried within it the seed. From the road, a passing traveler might see fields bursting with abundance and think Rome's countryside a paradise. But step closer, and you would hear the groan of tired voices, see the welts on bare backs, feel the weight of Rome's empire pressing down through the soil into the bodies that worked it. And yet, farm slaves, though low in price, were indispensable. Without them, the amphitheaters would have no grain for bread, the temples no oil for lamps, the wine shops no jars to pour. The city's luxury depended on the countryside's misery. Every loaf of bread in Rome carried the taste of sweat from an anonymous slave bending under the sun. How much did they cost? A few hundred sesterces, cheaper than a good hunting dog, cheaper than a piece of fine furniture. But the true cost was measured differently. In broken spines, in lives shortened by labor, in families never seen again. For the empire, it was a bargain. For the men and women who lived it, it was everything. As dusk settled over the latifundia, the fields grew quiet. Slaves trudged back to their barracks, shoulders heavy, eyes dull with fatigue. The overseer counted heads, locked doors, and pocketed the keys. Tomorrow before dawn the cycle would begin again. The wheat would grow, the olives would ripen, the grapes would sweeten, and Rome, hundreds of miles away, would feast, never tasting the chains hidden in its harvest. In the Roman slave market, not every price was set by strength or skill. Some were set by appearance. When a young woman was led to the platform, the air shifted. Buyers leaned forward, not to inspect muscles for plowing or fingers for carving stone, but to study her face, her hair, her posture. Rome valued beauty as much as it valued grain or iron, and beauty, cruelly, came at a price higher than most lives could imagine. The auctioneer's tone often softened for such sales, almost coaxing. "A girl of 16 from Syria," he would announce, his hand gesturing toward the slender figure standing before the crowd. Her tunic might be shorter, deliberately arranged to reveal limbs. Her hair might be combed and perfumed, her skin rubbed with oil. The placard at her neck was simple: healthy, musical, suitable for domestic service. The words hid what the buyers already knew. She was not meant for the fields or the kitchens. Bidding for young women could climb swiftly, 1,000 sesterces, 2,000, 5,000. If the girl was educated, trained in dance or song, or possessed striking beauty, the price might soar to 10,000 or more. Roman writers mention sums as high as 20,000 sesterces for courtesans and concubines of exceptional allure. To put this into perspective, a Roman soldier might earn 900 sesterces in an entire year. A girl's body could be priced at 20 times his wage. What were such women purchased for? Some became handmaids, attending to the mistress of the household, brushing her hair, fastening her jewelry, holding her mirror. Others became entertainers, singing at feasts, dancing to the sound of flutes, pouring wine with practiced grace. But many, perhaps most, were purchased as concubines or companions. Roman men, even married ones, often kept women outside of marriage, and slavery made it legal, unquestioned, and profitable. The cruelty lay not only in the purpose, but in the silence surrounding it. A girl might stand trembling on the platform, knowing her life would no longer be hers. Her family was gone, her future decided by the highest bidder. She could not refuse, could not speak. The auctioneer's hammer struck wood, and her fate was sealed in coin. And yet, paradoxically, beauty gave some women leverage. A concubine of great charm could hold influence in a household. A favored slave might sway her master's decisions, whisper in his ear, manage his affairs. Some women even used this influence to secure their freedom, persuading masters to grant them manumission. A few, once freed, rose to wealth and prominence. The mistress of Emperor Vespasian, a freedwoman named Caenis, had once been a slave in the imperial household. Her beauty and intelligence carried her from anonymity to the center of power. But for every Caenis, there were countless others whose names history never kept. The majority of women sold for beauty lived lives of quiet subjugation, hidden in private chambers, brought out for pleasure or display, their worth measured only by youth and charm. Time itself was their enemy. A woman's price was highest in her teens and early 20s. As age or hardship marked her, her value declined. Some were resold for domestic labor once their beauty faded, others discarded like worn garments. The market was merciless. The treatment of women slaves exposes Rome's deepest contradiction. This was a society that celebrated honor, virtue, and family, and yet it commodified women's bodies as casually as it did livestock. Roman poets wrote of beautiful slave girls with desire. Roman satirists joked of them. Roman law gave them no defense. They were simultaneously treasured and disposable, worshipped and degraded. The price of beauty was not only paid in coins, it was paid in freedom, in autonomy, in years stolen. A woman who fetched 10,000 sesterces at market did not own her fortune. She was her fortune. Masters might boast of what they paid, showing her off at banquets like a rare statue. Guests admired her, not as a person, and yet, in the quiet corners of households, these women lived complex lives. Some bore children, children who, under Roman law, were automatically slaves, property of the master. Some formed friendships with other servants, finding solace in whispered confidences. Some endured in silence, retreating into memory or song. A few fought back in subtle ways, withholding affection, resisting in spirit, if not in body. Historians note that some slave women were trained deliberately in arts of seduction, taught music, dance, and elegance precisely to fetch higher prices. This reveals the blunt economics of the trade. Beauty was cultivated, marketed, and sold like fine wine. Masters did not simply buy women, they invested in performances of allure. The slave market was, in this sense, both stage and shop, where human desire itself became commodity. In the countryside, the contrast was sharp. Women there were bought cheaply, valued for endurance rather than looks, sent into fields or presses. But in the city, in the villas of Rome and Pompeii, beauty commanded a premium. The mosaics and frescoes that survive often depict female slaves serving wine, reclining near couches, their posture graceful, their clothing artfully revealing. They were ornaments as much as servants, living decorations in the theater of Roman luxury. How much did Roman slaves cost? For women, the answer was often crueler than for men. A strong man might be bought for his back, a clever Greek for his mind. A woman might be bought simply for her body, and when her body ceased to please, her price fell with it. As evening fell on the marketplace, the day's beautiful slaves were led away, some to villas, some to brothels, some to households where they would live half-seen in shadowed rooms. Their prices would be recorded in ledgers, neat rows of numbers without faces. But their lives would ripple silently through Rome, in lullabies sung to masters' children, in feasts served with careful grace, in tears shed unseen. The price of beauty was counted in sesterces. The cost of it was borne in silence. If the Roman slave market was the theater and the household was the stage, then somewhere in the shadows there was always an accountant with a wax tablet, tallying the numbers. Slavery in Rome was not only a matter of bodies and chains, it was also a matter of balance sheets. Behind every purchase, every auctioneer's cry, there was a quiet arithmetic, profit and loss, investment and return. In a wealthy Roman estate, this arithmetic was the work of the villicus or dispensator. A steward, often himself a trusted slave or freedman, he was the man who carried the keys, counted the coins, and recorded in neat lines what every other human life had cost. His wax tablet might list names or simple descriptions. One Cappadocian farmhand, 400 sesterces. one cook, 2,500 sesterces, one Greek tutor, 9,000 sesterces. To a visitor, these looked like ordinary expenses, no different than jars of olive oil or amphorae of wine. The accountant did not write of grief, of families torn apart, of a child's clay toy discarded on a market floor. He wrote only of numbers, and Rome, in its pride, thrived on those numbers. The logic was chilling in its simplicity. A farm slave bought for 400 sesterces might live 10 years. If he produced 100 sesterces worth of grain each year, his master's investment would return more than double. A cook, though costly, might save a master reputation, keeping feasts grand and guests impressed, which in turn secured political alliances. A gladiator, though perilously expensive, might pay back tenfold in winnings and spectacle. Each life was calculated as an asset, each whip stroke justified as protecting the investment. This cold reasoning shows up even in the writings of Rome's agricultural thinkers. Cato the Elder, in his De Agricultura, advised landowners to sell worn-out slaves along with old tools and sick cattle. He treated them as interchangeable, nothing more than instruments of labor. "Sell the aged slaves," he wrote bluntly, "for they are of no use." To Cato, humanity was not part of the ledger, only utility. But not every Roman master followed such harsh mathematics. Some recognized that a slave, treated decently, could last longer and work better. Columella, writing later, warned against overwork and neglect. "A slave is more profitable when he is healthy," he argued, suggesting that feeding and clothing them properly was simply good business. Even kindness, in Rome, was framed as economics. The dispensator's records went deeper than purchases. He tracked losses, too. One field slave died of fever, value lost, 350 sesterces. One maid, punished for theft, unable to work, downgraded to kitchen. He calculated costs of punishment, chains, collars, even crucifixions, all written in dry shorthand. The violence of slavery was not only visible in scars, but hidden in arithmetic, etched in wax that could be smoothed and erased as easily as a life forgotten. For Rome's elite, such calculations became almost invisible. A senator reclining at a banquet did not ask how much the girl pouring his wine had cost. He knew only that his steward had tallied it, that the expense was justified, that the ledger balanced. The wealth of an estate was not only measured in land and villas, but in the value of its human property. An estate with 200 slaves might be worth millions in modern terms. A man's greatness was literally written in the number of lives he owned. And yet, in this cold system, cracks appeared. A slave with peculiar talents might defy the ledger. A boy who sang beautifully could be worth more than expected. A maid with clever hands at embroidery could be resold for higher profit. Conversely, a costly tutor might fall ill, rendering the investment useless. Rome's arithmetic, like all arithmetic, could never fully capture the chaos of life. There were also hidden costs: the fear of rebellion, the expense of guards, the risk of escape. Spartacus's uprising, a century before the empire's height, had shown Rome what happened when the ledger failed to control the lives it counted. Thousands of slaves broke free, turning fields into battlegrounds. The financial losses were immense. Rome responded by crucifying 6,000 along the Appian Way, a grim reminder that rebellion was always costlier than cruelty. Still, the ledgers continued. Numbers marched across wax and papyrus, neat and unfeeling. Slaves were borrowed against loans, pledged as collateral, even inherited like furniture. One master might write in his will, "To my son, I leave 2 estates and 50 slaves. To my daughter, 10 handmaids and 1 nurse." The human beings themselves had no say. They were passed from hand to hand like coins, their worth preserved in ink. Sometimes, though, the numbers betrayed a strange humanity. In rare cases, masters freed slaves not for profit, but affection. A nurse who had raised a child might be manumitted as gratitude. A trusted valet might be rewarded after decades of loyalty. In the ledger the line read, "1 slave freed, value lost 0. But in truth it was not value lost but value transformed. Freedmen often remained close, serving willingly, their loyalty beyond what money could buy. For the slaves themselves, the ledger was a ghostly presence. Most never saw the tablets, never knew the number written beside their names, yet they felt its weight in every command, every task. A careless accident meant not just a scolding, but a loss to the master's investment. A runaway risked punishment not only for disobedience, but for damaging the balance sheet. In Rome, a life was always measured twice, once in breath, once in coin. By evening, the steward's lamp burned late. His stylus scratched into wax, correcting figures, noting expenditures, smoothing errors. Outside, the city roared with games and gossip. Inside, the quiet work of empire continued, invisible but essential. Rome did not run on poetry or law alone. It ran on ledgers, thousands of tiny records that reduced humanity to numbers and made the machine of slavery efficient enough to endure for centuries. When we ask today, how much did Roman slaves cost? The answers live in those ledgers. 200 for a child, 500 for a farmhand, 10,000 for a courtesan. But the true cost was not written there. The wax tablets could never capture the nights a mother wept for a child sold, the strength of a man bent to breaking, the silence of a woman whose beauty was her prison. The ledger recorded only coins. History records the rest. And so, in the quiet scratch of stylus against wax, we hear not just numbers, but the faint echo of Rome's great contradiction, an empire built on human worth, calculated in sesterces, yet incapable of counting the cost of its own cruelty. If an ordinary Roman household was a stage of servants, the emperor's palace was an empire of them. In marble corridors lined with statues of gods, behind golden doors guarded by soldiers, lived the most valuable slaves in all of Rome, the imperial household. They were not anonymous field hands or cooks for modest villas. They were the hands, eyes, and ears of the emperor himself, and their prices, their roles, and their influence dwarfed almost every other corner of Roman slavery. From the outside, one might imagine the emperor, Augustus, Tiberius, Nero, or any who followed, surrounded only by senators, generals, and noble advisors. But step inside the palace, and you would find an army of slaves running its every detail. Imperial slaves cooked the emperor's meals, carried his letters, polished his armor, arranged his entertainments, and even managed his finances. Some were little more than attendants, others held power rivaling senators. Their prices reflected this range. A kitchen worker in the palace might have cost a few thousand sesterces, more than most cooks, but far less than a gladiator. But a secretary who could write swiftly, translate Greek and Latin, and manage correspondence could fetch staggering sums, 10,000, even 20,000 sesterces. The emperor's life was bound to parchment and ink, and a skilled scribe was as valuable as any general's sword. Consider the role of the rationibus, the slave who managed the emperor's accounts. He knew the empire's revenues, its expenditures, its secrets. His price in the marketplace would have been astronomical, though most such men were carefully trained within the palace itself. A master who bought a slave with this level of talent was not buying labor, but trust. Trust in the smooth handling of millions of sesterces, in the balancing of Rome's vast machine. Trust, as always, was the most expensive commodity of all. The imperial chamberlains, the cubiculari, were even more extraordinary. These were the slaves who attended the emperor in his private chambers, who dressed him, arranged his bed, stood silently by when he spoke in confidence. Proximity here was power. A chamberlain might whisper a suggestion, pass along a message, delay a visitor at the door. Such small acts could shape decisions that changed provinces, generals, wars. Some of these men became so influential that senators bowed to them, knowing the emperor's ear was theirs. It was in the imperial household that Rome's contradiction became most visible. Here were slaves, legally property, legally voiceless, yet wielding immense authority. They were bought, sold, and inherited like any other, but their value soared not only in coin, but in influence. Some historians argue that the imperial court was shaped as much by these slaves as by emperors themselves. The market for such men and women was not public. You did not see imperial secretaries paraded on auction blocks. Instead, they were cultivated quietly, trained from youth, passed carefully through the household. But their worth was whispered about, their rarity compared to jewels. A Greek philosopher, sold as a tutor, might fetch 15,000 sesterces. But an imperial chamberlain, trusted with the emperor's secrets, was worth more than gold. And yet, for every Narcissus or Pallas, there were dozens who remained invisible. A torchbearer lighting corridors, a maid folding garments, a stable boy tending horses for imperial processions. Their prices were modest, their lives hidden in shadow, but together they made the palace breathe. The emperor's glory was staged daily by these unseen figures. Without them, marble halls would fall silent. The risks were immense. To be so close to the emperor was dangerous as well as valuable. A slave who failed in his duty, who angered a master already suspicious of plots, could be executed in an instant. Emperors were not always forgiving men. Nero, paranoid and mercurial, had slaves tortured for rumors of betrayal. Caligula, with his infamous cruelty, treated some of his attendants with mockery or worse. Proximity was a privilege, but it was also a hazard. Still, the palace remained the most coveted destination for many. To be bought into the imperial household was to be set apart. It was the top of the pyramid, the place where a slave's skills, loyalty, or beauty could fetch the highest price. It was a place where chains were gilded, where servitude brushed against power, where a life reduced to property could suddenly shape the destiny of Rome. When we ask, how much did Roman slaves cost? The answer changes in the palace. Here, value was not only in coin, but in closeness. A farmhand might be worth 400 sesterces, a cook in a villa 3,000. But a chamberlain who could whisper to the emperor at night, what was his price? 5,000? 10,000? Or was his worth measured in victories won, provinces governed, laws decreed at his suggestion? As evening fell, lamps flickered along the palace corridors. Somewhere, an imperial scribe bent over parchment, his stylus scratching the words of law. Somewhere else, a chamberlain laid out the emperor's robe for mourning, smoothing each fold with practiced care. The palace glittered with marble and bronze, but its true treasure was human. The slaves who cost more than estates, who lived without names in history, yet held the empire in their hands. See, Rome's heartbeat in the Forum, but its blood flowed from far beyond Italy. The empire's appetite for labor was endless, and its hunger could never be satisfied by local markets alone. Slaves poured into Rome from every corner of the known world: Gaul, Spain, North Africa, Asia Minor, Thrace, Syria. Each province was a vein in the great body of Rome, and in every province stood an auction block. The auctions abroad were not the polished theaters of Rome's capital. They were rougher, more urgent, often staged in coastal ports or provincial towns. Ships docked heavy with cargo, amphorae of wine, bales of wool, and, chained below deck, human beings. The sea carried them from one world to another. Gauls captured in uprisings, Numidians taken in wars across the desert, Jews enslaved after rebellion, Germans dragged from forests, they all met the same fate. On the docks of Delos, a Greek island under Roman control, slave markets were infamous. Ancient writers said as many as 10,000 slaves could change hands in a single day. The scene must have been overwhelming. Rows of men and women herded ashore, salt still in their hair, fear in their eyes. Auctioneers shouted prices in Latin and Greek, their voices bouncing against stone warehouses. Merchants jostled, weighing purses heavy with coin. Prices abroad varied by origin. A strong German male, tall and broad-shouldered, fetched higher sums for farm or military labor. Buyers believed them hardy, though also rebellious. A Gaulish woman with fair hair and striking features might cost several thousand sesterces as a concubine or handmaid. Numidian slaves, skilled with horses, were prized in stables. Syrians, often educated, commanded higher prices as scribes or tutors. The market was as much about stereotypes as reality. Buyers paid not only for the body, but for the story attached to it. The cheapest slaves were often prisoners of mass war. After Julius Caesar's conquest of Gaul, thousands of captives were sold in bulk, so numerous that the flood depressed market prices. Some went for less than 200 sesterces, barely more than a donkey. To Romans, it was efficient. To the captives, it was devastation. Entire villages emptied, entire peoples scattered. Yet not all auctions abroad were chaotic. In Carthage, rebuilt under Roman control, the market was more organized, feeding Italy's estates. There, buyers came specifically for agricultural slaves, men and women hardy enough to endure the African sun. In Asia Minor, auctions specialized in educated captives, Greeks who could be sold as tutors, physicians, or accountants. The provincial markets had their reputations, their specialties, like shops in a vast human bazaar. The logistics of this trade reveal Rome's machine-like precision. Captives were marched to coastal depots, sorted by age, sex, and skill. Those unfit for long travel, too old, too sick, were often sold cheaply on the spot or discarded. The rest were loaded onto ships, shackled, sometimes branded to mark ownership. Storms, disease, and starvation claimed many before landfall. Those who survived were oiled, washed, sometimes perfumed, then displayed on platforms as if their suffering could be erased by polish. Buyers abroad were not only Romans. Wealthy provincials, eager to mimic Rome's grandeur, bought slaves to run their villas and workshops. In Gaul, a Romanized merchant might purchase his own countrymen, using their labor to build estates in imitation of Italian models. In North Africa, slave markets buzzed with Punic and Berber voices alongside Latin. The empire's economy was not only conquest, but commerce, binding together distant peoples in chains. What made these auctions chilling was their ordinariness. To walk through a port town was to pass cages of children, lines of men in shackles, women seated under awnings awaiting buyers. No one flinched. It was business. The coins clinked, the scribes recorded, the ships prepared for another voyage. For Rome, slavery was not a dark secret. It was a visible, thriving industry. And still, in the midst of all this, moments of humanity broke through. A buyer might hesitate, struck by the eyes of a girl who looked like his daughter. A merchant might pay extra to keep a family together, though most did not. Sometimes, sailors who had transported captives wept when they unloaded them, though they still took their pay. These were exceptions, fleeting and fragile, swallowed quickly by the market's rhythm. Prices abroad could fluctuate wildly depending on supply. After a major war, captives flooded markets, lowering value. During peace, when fewer slaves were captured, prices rose. Rome's economy itself rose and fell with conquest. Every battle fought was not only for territory but for human cargo. War was profitable not just in land but in bodies. By the time these slaves reached Rome itself, their prices might have doubled or tripled. A clever trader could buy cheaply in Delos or Carthage, transport captives safely, and sell them in the capital for enormous profit. Slaves, like spices or silk, were commodities in Rome's global network, shipped, stored, and sold with the same mercantile eye. When we ask, how much did Roman slaves cost, we must ask, where? In Rome, prices reflected prestige and demand. Abroad, they reflected conquest and chaos. A Syrian scholar in Asia Minor might sell for 12,000 sesterces. The same man, if marched to Rome, might fetch even more. A German boy captured in forests might sell cheaply in Gaul, but in the capital, with his exotic look, he might be worth a fortune as a novelty. Geography itself was part of the price. As dusk fell over Delos, the docks emptied. Ships prepared to depart, loaded with grain, wine, and people. The auctions had ended, the coins exchanged, the ledgers updated. Some captives remained in the warehouses, waiting for tomorrow's sale. Others marched away with new masters, their chains clinking in the twilight. The sea, glittering red with sunset, carried their cries into silence. Rome's greatness depended not only on what happened within its walls, but on these distant markets. The empire's reach was measured in coins exchanged across provinces, inhuman bodies car. Rome's economy depended on its slaves, but beneath the empire's glittering marble lay a constant, unspoken fear. What if the chains broke? What if the men and women counted in ledgers rose against their masters? Rome liked to imagine its power eternal, but the memory of rebellion haunted it like a shadow. The greatest of these shadows bore a name still famous: Spartacus. In 73 BCE, long before the empire reached its height, a gladiator in Capua led an escape. Spartacus was a Thracian by birth, once a soldier, captured and sold into the arena. He was trained to fight, strong and intelligent, but he had no desire to die for Roman entertainment. Alongside about 70 other gladiators, armed first with kitchen knives and later with seized weapons, he broke from his barracks and fled into the hills. What began as desperation soon grew into war. Slaves flocked to him by the thousands. Farm laborers abandoned fields, miners crawled out of shafts, shepherds left their flocks. They came carrying hoes, axes, even sticks, anything that could be turned against Rome. At its height, Spartacus's army may have numbered 70,000. To the Senate, this was no longer a band of fugitives. It was an uprising. The fear spread faster than the rebellion itself. Rome had long seen slaves as property, not people. But now property fought back. Villas were burned, estates raided, Roman families fled the countryside. The Senate dispatched armies only to see them defeated again and again. Spartacus's forces moved with skill, outmaneuvering generals, striking with ferocity. Each victory made the fear sharper. If slaves could beat legions, what did that mean for the foundations of Roman power? For masters, the rebellion transformed the meaning of cost. A slave was no longer simply an investment in labor. He was a potential threat. To own hundreds of field slaves was suddenly not only wealth, but risk. A careless overseer, a cruel punishment, a rumor of revolt. These could ignite catastrophe. The value of a slave was now measured not just in sesterces, but in danger. For masters, the rebellion transformed the meaning of cost. A slave was no longer simply an investment in labor. He was a potential threat. To own hundreds of field slaves was suddenly not only wealth, but risk. A careless overseer, a cruel punishment, a rumor of revolt. These could ignite catastrophe. The value of a slave was now measured not just in sesterces, but in danger. When Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Rome, was finally given command against Spartacus, he restored order with iron discipline. He crucified 6,000 captured rebels along the Appian Way, their bodies stretched on crosses for miles, a grotesque warning to any who dreamed of freedom. The rebellion ended in blood, but its echo lingered. Rome had survived, but the illusion of total control had cracked. From then on, fear shaped policy. Owners grew more cautious, some granting small privileges to keep slaves loyal. Peculium, personal savings, was allowed more widely, offering the faint hope of freedom. Some masters encouraged family life among slaves, reasoning that men with wives and children were less likely to rebel. Others relied on brutality, doubling punishments, hiring more overseers, arming guards. Whether through reward or terror, the goal was the same: prevent another Spartacus. Prices too were affected. Strong young men from regions known for resistance, Thrace, Gaul, Germany, were both prized for labor and distrusted for rebellion. Buyers weighed this tension carefully. A Thracian might fetch a high price for his strength, but his reputation as dangerous added invisible cost. Merchants whispered these calculations at markets, balancing desire for productivity against the dread of insurrection. The rebellion also reshaped Rome's imagination. Plays, poems, and histories retold Spartacus's story, sometimes with horror, sometimes with grudging admiration. He became both villain and hero, a reminder that the enslaved were not voiceless things, but men who could fight, bleed, and terrify Rome itself. For centuries, even emperors carried the memory of his name, a ghost at every banquet. And yet Rome never abandoned slavery. The rebellion did not dismantle the system, it only scarred it. The latifundia continued, the markets bustled, the ledgers grew fat. Rome's appetite for conquest and cheap labor was too great, but the rebellion remained a cautionary tale, carved into memory like a scar across the empire's skin. What makes Spartacus's revolt haunting is not only its scale, but its humanity. Imagine the campfires in the hills, flickering against dark skies, men and women singing in their native tongues, tasting freedom for the first time in years. Imagine the fear and hope, the mixture of desperation and pride. For them, each day was not about price or profit, but survival, dignity, a glimpse of a life no ledger could record. To the Romans, those fires were nightmares. To the slaves, they were stars of their own making. When we ask, how much did Roman slaves cost? Spartacus's answer is different. Sometimes they cost more than sesterces. Sometimes they cost fear itself. A single slave could be worth thousands of coins. 1,000 slaves together could be worth the panic of a nation. Rome learned that lesson the hard way, crucified along its own roads. As the years passed, the rebellion faded into history. Travelers along the Appian Way forgot the bodies that once lined it. New slaves, unaware of Spartacus, were sold in the same markets. But the fear never truly left. Every whip crack carried the whisper, "Remember Spartacus." Every coin spent on a strong young man carried the thought, "What if he turns?" Rome's empire endured for centuries, but its foundations were always brittle. Beneath its marble arches and golden domes lived millions who dreamed of breaking chains. Spartacus showed the world and Rome itself that even property could rise and fight. The empire silenced him with blood, but it never silenced the memory. In Rome, a slave was legally property, owned like a table or a lamp. And yet, in the spaces between law and life, something remarkable happened. Slaves sometimes earned money. They were given peculium, a personal allowance, a daily wage, or tips collected from their work. It was not freedom, but it was a shadow of it, a pocket of independence in a system built to deny it. The practice began with practicality. A master realized that allowing a slave to keep a small sum encouraged loyalty. A servant who received coins for errands or tips from guests might work more willingly. A craftsman allowed to sell his work in the market could bring in profit for his master, while still saving a portion for himself. Even a gladiator, though trained for blood, might earn coin from admirers. Rome discovered that a slave with hope in his hand was more valuable than one with nothing. The amounts were small at first. A household servant might earn a few copper asses a week, slipped quietly by a generous guest after dinner. A porter at the baths might be tipped for carrying oil flasks. A reader, reciting poetry, might be rewarded by a patron who enjoyed the sound of his voice. These coins, tucked away in hidden jars or knotted in cloth, became the beginnings of a slave's secret treasury. But peculium was more than tips. Some masters allowed formal arrangements. A craftsman, for example, might be permitted to run a workshop producing pottery or cloth. He gave the majority of his earnings to his master, but kept a fraction for himself. Over years, those fractions grew into a small fortune. Some slaves managed estates, collected rents, and conducted business on behalf of their owners, ironically, becoming managers of wealth they could not legally possess. Yet within these duties, they often carved out savings. For many, the dream of peculium was manumission, freedom. Roman law allowed a slave to buy his own liberty if he could pay his master an agreed sum. It was a paradox. A man bought once in chains could, through years of labor and saving, buy himself back. The price varied, sometimes the same as his purchase cost, sometimes more, depending on the master's greed or generosity. But the path was there, a narrow road out of bondage. Stories survive of slaves who walked that road. A scribe who copied manuscripts late into the night, selling extra work to friends, saving coin by coin until he bought his freedom. A seamstress who stitched garments for the market, hiding a fraction of her profit until she had enough. A gladiator who fought, won purses of silver, and purchased release with blood-earned money. These tales echo faintly in history, small victories carved out of oppression. The daily wage also carried dignity. To hold a coin was to feel human, to imagine choice. A slave who had peculium could buy better sandals, a warmer cloak, or a sweet cake at the market. He could offer gifts to friends, support a lover, even save for his children. These were tiny freedoms, but they mattered. In a world where law erased personhood, peculium restored a glimpse of it. Masters, of course, never forgot the balance of power. Peculium was not a right, it was permission. A master could revoke it at will, confiscating savings, crushing hope in an instant. Many did. A slave too ambitious, too eager for freedom, might be punished by losing everything. For others, peculium was dangled as a carrot, a promise never fulfilled. The daily wage was always fragile, balanced on the whim of ownership. Still, the system endured because it worked. Rome's vast machine ran smoother when its gears were oiled with hope. A slave who believed he might one day be free worked harder, obeyed more readily, endured more patiently. The economy of peculium was not just money, it was psychology. It transformed despair into labor, silence into compliance. In the eyes of masters, it was efficient. In the eyes of slaves, it was salvation. Freedom through peculium was not rare. Manumission became a feature of Roman life, so common that freedmen, former slaves, formed a distinct class. They could become citizens, marry, own property, and even rise to wealth. Many remained tied to their former masters as clients, but they lived with names, rights, and dignity. Some even owned slaves themselves, repeating the cycle they had once endured. Rome was filled with freedmen whose lives were built on the patient saving of peculium. And yet, freedom was not guaranteed. Many slaves died before their savings reached enough. Many saw their peculium seized. Many lived their lives in hope only to find the cost too high. A daily wage could build dreams, but it could also stretch them endlessly, a carrot always just out of reach. In the markets, prices told one story: 200 sesterces for a child, 500 for a farmhand, 10,000 for a courtesan. But in the hidden pockets of peculium, another economy pulsed, an economy of hope. Here, a single coin mattered. Here, the value of a day's work was not for Rome or the master, but for the slave himself. Imagine a young man sweeping a villa floor. A guest tosses him a coin, silver catching the lamplight. The boy palms it quickly, tucking it into his tunic. That coin is not just metal. It is a piece of tomorrow, a whisper of freedom. He may save for years, decades, but each coin carries the weight of possibility. How much did Roman slaves cost? The answer lies not only in markets and ledgers, but in hidden jars of coins buried beneath straw mattresses, in secret smiles when wages were saved, in the quiet defiance of men and women who built freedom out of fragments. The empire measured them in sesterces. They measured themselves in coins of hope. By night, in the silence of the slave quarters, you might hear the faint clink of a coin turned over in a hand. A small sound, easily lost in the noise of Rome, but it was the sound of survival, of patience, of futures quietly forged in the dark. In Rome, the value of a slave was not always measured in muscle, skill, or beauty. Sometimes it was measured in something rarer: loyalty. The bond between master and slave could be fraught with cruelty, but in certain cases it hardened into trust so deep that the slave's worth became greater than gold. Masters would spend fortunes to keep such servants close, for in a world of betrayal and ambition, loyalty was the most expensive commodity of all. The Roman household was a theater of secrets. A senator whispering plans to his wife, a merchant counting profits by lamplight, an emperor muttering orders in the dead of night. All of these had witnesses. And those witnesses were often slaves: the chamberlain in the corner, the maid at the curtain, the scribe at the table. A careless word could mean ruin if carried outside. A loyal slave, silent and steadfast, was beyond price. Stories from history show how Rome prized this rare devotion. Take the case of Epaphroditus, secretary to Emperor Nero. Once a slave, later freed, Epaphroditus became so trusted that Nero relied on him for personal matters, including the final moment of his life. When Nero, hunted and abandoned, chose suicide, It was Epaphroditus who helped him drive the blade. That act, grim and intimate, shows how close a master could hold a servant, and how a servant's loyalty could outlast even power itself. Masters recognized the danger of betrayal, and so they rewarded loyalty lavishly. A faithful slave might be granted better food, finer clothing, or a comfortable room. Some were given peculium far greater than ordinary, accelerating their path to freedom. Others were freed outright, not for coin, but as a gift of gratitude. In wills, masters sometimes left property or money to loyal servants, gestures meant to outlive death. In Roman law, this generosity was not unusual. It was recognition that some bonds could not be broken by chains alone. The cost of loyalty also showed in purchases. Buyers paid higher prices for slaves with reputations for trust. A chamberlain who had served one noble family faithfully might be resold for a fortune to another, his history written in recommendations like fine parchment. He does not steal, a seller might say. He does not gossip. He does not betray. Such qualities, invisible but invaluable, could double a price. A strong back was common. A loyal heart was rare. And yet, loyalty was always complicated. For slaves, devotion to a master could be survival strategy as much as affection. To prove trustworthy meant safety, opportunity, even manumission. Some loved their masters genuinely, bonded by years of shared life. Others feigned loyalty, wearing obedience like armor against punishment. Rome's system blurred sincerity and necessity until even historians cannot always tell which was which. But masters believed, and belief itself had value. A man who trusted his slaves slept more soundly, ate without fear of poison, shared secrets without suspicion. For that peace of mind, he would pay dearly. In this way, loyalty became not just moral, but economic. It was worth as much as marble, more than fields of wheat. There are stories of slaves who saved their masters' lives, throwing themselves between them and assassins, or carrying them to safety in battle. These acts, rare but celebrated, elevated a slave's status beyond price. Some were freed on the spot, others rewarded with wealth. The gesture was remembered in epitaphs. To Marcus, once my slave, who saved me in war and remained faithful until death. Such inscriptions reveal how Romans valued loyalty, not only as duty, but as a treasure that could never truly be purchased. At the same time, the absence of loyalty was devastating. Betrayal was feared most of all. A slave who poisoned a cup, who whispered secrets to enemies, who joined a rebellion. This was a nightmare every master carried. The cost of disloyalty was measured in lives lost, estates ruined, reputations destroyed. For this reason, loyalty was prized so highly. It was the wall that kept fear at bay. In the marketplace, buyers sometimes asked not only about strength or skills, but about temperament. Was the slave obedient, honest, docile? A history of disobedience lowered the price. A reputation for faithfulness raised it. In ledgers, one might see notes like household steward, loyal for 10 years, 8,000 sesterces. Trust here was literally written into value. The paradox of loyalty in Rome is that it thrived in chains. Men and women denied freedom could still give, or appear to give, the most intimate form of devotion. Masters, hungry for reassurance, paid heavily for it. Slaves, navigating survival, offered it in exchange for protection, advancement, sometimes genuine affection. Out of this imbalance grew relationships that confused ownership and kinship, cruelty and kindness, property and personhood. How much did Roman slaves cost? For loyalty, the answer was always more than coin could count. A strong arm could be bought for hundreds, a beautiful face for thousands, but a heart that stayed true, a mouth that kept secrets, a hand that saved in crisis, that was priceless. By night, when households fell silent, the most trusted slaves moved quietly through the corridors. A chamberlain checking locks, a nurse watching over children, a secretary organizing documents. Masters slept, secure in the belief that someone loyal kept watch. That security itself was the cost of loyalty. invisible yet immense, a price paid not in sesterces, but in peace of mind. For some, loyalty was rewarded with freedom, property, even affection remembered in stone inscriptions. For others, it was never recognized, their devotion buried with them in silence. But whether celebrated or ignored, loyalty shaped Rome's world. Without it, fear would have torn households apart. With it, the empire endured. For every story of trust and loyalty in Rome, there was its shadow: punishment. If loyalty could raise a slave's value beyond measure, punishment could reduce it to nothing. Rome's economy ran on the arithmetic of profit, but it was enforced by pain. To maintain obedience, masters wielded the whip, the brand, the chain, and sometimes the cross. A slave could be priceless one day, worthless the next, all depending on how Rome measured discipline. In the slave market, placards sometimes carried warnings: prone to run away, stubborn, scars from punishment. Such marks lowered the price, just as cracks devalue pottery. Buyers were cautious. Damaged goods meant unreliable labor. A man who had been whipped too many times might limp. A woman branded on the face with the letters fug, for fugitivus, runaway, was a public declaration of disobedience. These bodies bore the cost of rebellion, written not in ledgers but in skin. Punishment took many forms, each with its own logic. The lash was most common. Stripes cut deep into backs and shoulders, a daily reminder of ownership. Chains came next, fastened to ankles, wrists, or necks, dragging noise with every step. Collars of iron, sometimes inscribed with humiliating inscriptions, announced disobedience. If you find me, return me to my master. The body became the billboard of punishment, visible proof that disobedience carried consequences. For graver offenses, punishment turned brutal. A slave who stole might be branded with hot iron, his value reduced permanently. A runaway once captured might be forced to wear shackles for life. A conspirator in rebellion could be crucified, his death not only an end, but a lesson, displayed along roads where thousands passed. Rome's roads were lined not only with milestones, but with crosses, grim punctuation marks in the empire's geography. The household punishments could be equally cruel, though quieter. A cook who spoiled a dish might be beaten in front of guests as entertainment. A maid accused of gossip might be whipped in the atrium. Masters used discipline as theater, demonstrating power to family and visitors alike. In these moments, punishment was not only correction, but performance, a spectacle of dominance. Economics shaped the cruelty. An expensive slave, a Greek tutor, a skilled artisan, was less likely to be beaten to death. His master had too much invested. Discipline for such slaves might come in subtler forms: loss of privileges, reduction of peculium, public humiliation. But for the cheap and plentiful, the field hands, the quarry workers, punishment could be merciless. A farm slave worth only 400 sesterces could be worked to death and replaced. The ledger forgave cruelty when profit did. This calculus reveals Rome's paradox. Slaves were both property and people, both valuable and disposable. Their punishment was weighed against their price. Too much cruelty diminished usefulness, too little risked rebellion. Masters walked this line constantly, their whips both tools and symbols. Some philosophers criticized this. Seneca, the Stoic, argued that slaves should be treated as fellow humans. "They are our companions, not our cattle," he wrote. He warned that excessive cruelty degraded the master as much as the slave, but such voices were rare. Most Romans saw punishment as natural, even necessary, the price of maintaining order. Mercy was optional. Discipline was mandatory. The cost of punishment went beyond the body. It carried into markets. A branded face meant a lower price at resale. A limp from past beatings meant less endurance in fields. A history of attempted escape meant suspicion forever, chains added as insurance. These losses were calculated coldly by accountants, who recorded depreciation of human value as if marking the wear of tools. Yet even in punishment, resistance lingered. Some slaves bore scars with pride, silent badges of defiance. Others risked punishment again and again, refusing to bow fully to chains. There are records of slaves who laughed under torture, spitting in the faces of masters who demanded obedience. Their bodies might break, but their spirit refused valuation. Rome's cruelty could control labor, but never fully erase dignity. Punishment also revealed the fragility of loyalty. A slave trusted for years could be reduced to nothing with a single lash. A chamberlain once prized might be executed on suspicion of betrayal. Loyalty, carefully nurtured, was destroyed in an instant. The cost of punishment, then, was not only borne by the slave, it was borne by the master too, who traded trust for fear, stability for brutality. And still, punishment remained Rome's default. The system could not function without it. The sight of chains kept others in line. The smell of iron burned into flesh reminded the household of consequence. The crosses along the Appian Way whispered the price of defiance for generations. Rome's greatness was not only marble and law, it was also blood and scars. When we ask, how much did Roman slaves cost? Punishment gives its own answer. Sometimes they cost less than the iron that marked them. A cheap farm slave could be beaten until he collapsed, replaced by another from the market. But punishment also revealed the limits of price. What is the cost of a man who refuses to bend, even under the lash? What is the cost of a woman branded yet unbroken? Rome tried to answer with whips and crosses, but the question lingered beyond economics. At night, in the slave quarters, men and women traced scars on their skin like maps. Each line was a story of theft, of resistance, of defiance, of survival. These scars were not in the ledgers, not priced in sesterces, but they were the true account books of Rome's cruelty. Rome's empire was built on two foundations, its soldiers and its slaves. One wore armor, the other chains. One marched with standards held high, the other bent beneath burdens. Yet in the arithmetic of empire, both were measured in cost. The price of a slave could be set against the expense of training a soldier, and Rome, practical to the core, often weighed one against the other. A Roman soldier, a legionary, was not cheap to maintain. He required training, armor, weapons, rations, and pay. Historians estimate that the state spent roughly 1,000 sesterces per year per soldier, his wages alone about 900, plus the cost of equipment. Over 20 years of service, a soldier represented tens of thousands of sesterces in investment. But he was the lifeblood of Rome's conquests, and conquest in turn fed the markets with slaves. A slave, by contrast, could be purchased outright. A farmhand for 400 sesterces, a cook for 2,000, a tutor for 8,000. Once bought, he received no wages, only food and a place to sleep. To a landowner, the expense seemed small compared to the state's cost of a soldier. Yet the comparison was not so simple. A soldier gave his loyalty to Rome, bound by oath. A slave gave labor under compulsion, bound by fear. One fought for citizenship, the other fought to survive. The paradox lay in conquest itself. Soldiers captured the slaves who then became the property of landowners. The state bore the expense of soldiers, but private households reaped the profits of slavery. Rome's economy thrived on this cycle. Legions won wars. Wars produced captives. Captives became slaves. Slaves enriched Rome. Without soldiers, there would be no slaves. Without slaves, Rome's wealth could not sustain soldiers. The two were bound in a grim partnership. The comparison also played out in value. A skilled gladiator might cost 12,000 sesterces, as much as equipping a small unit of soldiers. A Greek philosopher sold as a tutor could be valued like a decorated centurion. In economic terms, Rome measured men not by their humanity, but by their utility. The sword in hand or the stylus on parchment, the back in the field or the shield on the battlefield. Each had a price. For the slaves themselves, the soldier was both captor and contrast. Soldiers filled the markets with captives, yet they were also, in a sense, slaves of Rome. Bound by oath, enduring harsh discipline, subject to flogging and execution for disobedience, the legionary's life was not free in the way a senator's was. Roman writers sometimes drew this comparison openly. "The soldier is Rome's slave," one satirist remarked, "but at least he is paid." The cost of punishment mirrored this. Soldiers who deserted were crucified, just as rebellious slaves were. Both groups knew the lash, the chain, the constant threat of discipline. Both were tools of the empire, though one was celebrated with parades, while the other was hidden in ledgers. The line between soldier and slave was drawn in citizenship and coin, not always in suffering. The cost of punishment mirrored this. Soldiers who deserted were crucified, just as rebellious slaves were. Both groups knew the lash, the chain, the constant threat of discipline. Both were tools of the empire, though one was celebrated with parades while the other was hidden in ledgers. The line between soldier and slave was drawn in citizenship and coin, not always in suffering. Yet soldiers had one priceless advantage: honor. Their service was framed as duty, sacrifice, glory. They marched beneath standards with eagles, their names remembered in inscriptions. A soldier might retire with land, citizenship for his family, respect in his community. A slave, no matter how loyal or skilled, began and ended as property, unless luck, peculium, or a master's generosity granted freedom. Where soldiers paid with blood and sweat for Rome, slaves paid with their very selves. Economically, Rome knew the difference. The treasury accounted for every legionary, calculating costs, distributing supplies, ensuring pay. Slaves, by contrast, were private investments, their prices circulating in markets, their fates hidden in household accounts. To compare the two was to compare state and private wealth, public defense and personal luxury, yet in the end, both fed the same machine: empire. There were moments when the two worlds collided. Soldiers sometimes became slave overseers after retirement, bringing their discipline to the estates. Others grew rich from conquest, returning home with captives sold for profit. Still others freed their own children born from enslaved women, blurring lines between conqueror and conquered. Rome was filled with these contradictions, where the soldier's coin and the slave's chain were minted from the same war. How much did Roman slaves cost? The answer shifts when held against soldiers. A farm slave for 400 sesterces was cheaper than equipping a soldier for a year. A tutor for 8,000 was dearer than 20 years of legionary wages. A gladiator for 12,000 rivaled the cost of an entire cohort's annual upkeep. Rome measured both lives in numbers, deciding what was worth more: labor at home or victory abroad. In truth, Rome needed both. Without soldiers, there were no slaves. Without slaves, there was no wealth to fund soldiers. The empire's glory was a cycle of conquest and servitude, spinning endlessly, fueled by the blood of soldiers and the sweat of slaves. Rome celebrated one, silenced the other, but it could not have survived without both. At night, in the camps along the frontier, soldiers huddled by fires, counting their pay, dreaming of land after service. In the fields of Italy, slaves huddled in barracks, counting stolen coins of peculium, dreaming of freedom. Both looked to the horizon for a day when labor ended. Both paid a cost Rome never truly counted. Rome's empire was not only built on stone and steel, but also on rituals. Every triumph, every harvest, every battle won was framed by sacrifice, incense, and prayer. The gods were everywhere: in the household shrine, in the public temples, in the silent awe of the augur gazing at birds in the sky. And behind the priests, behind the marble columns, behind the offerings on the altar, there were slaves. Slaves in temples were not the kind who bent beneath plows or swung hammers in mines. Their work was sacred, or at least cloaked in the aura of sacredness. They polished bronze lamps until they gleamed in the dim light of sanctuaries. They carried sacrificial animals to the altar, their hands guiding oxen heavy with garlands. They prepared incense, tended the fires, washed the vessels used in ritual. In grand temples like that of Jupiter Optimus Maximus on the Capitoline Hill, entire teams of slaves worked unseen, making sure Rome's prayers to the gods ran as smoothly as its armies. Their prices reflected this status. A slave purchased for temple service might cost more than an ordinary farmhand, for he needed to be presentable, obedient, and sometimes educated in ritual. A boy who could sing hymns, trained to chant in Greek or Latin, might fetch thousands of sesterces. A girl chosen to serve in temple households, graceful and modest, might also command a higher price than a laborer. To own or donate such a slave to a temple was an act of piety, but it was also a mark of wealth. Indeed, many wealthy Romans donated slaves to temples as offerings to the gods. The act served two purposes. It displayed devotion, while simultaneously relieving the household of the expense of maintaining more dependents. To give a slave to a temple was framed as generosity, but it also transferred responsibility. The gods gained a servant, the master gained prestige. The slave, of course, had no choice. His fate was rededicated, carved into duty beneath divine eyes. In some temples, particularly those of Eastern cults imported into Rome, slaves took on more specialized roles. They acted as attendants to priests, keepers of sacred objects, even interpreters of oracles. Some cults required elaborate ceremonies, where slaves dressed in ritual garments, processed through streets, or played instruments in honor of gods like Isis, Cybele, or Mithras. Their labor was theatrical, woven into the spectacle of religion. But not all temple slaves lived dignified lives. Some were tasked with the menial, cleaning blood from altars after sacrifice, carrying refuse, sweeping the endless marble steps. A temple was not only a place of prayer, it was a place of constant maintenance, and slaves bore the brunt of it. Their worth in the market was practical, not exalted, valued for obedience and endurance more than for holiness. There were also sacred prostitutes in certain temples, especially in the eastern provinces. Though Rome itself sometimes frowned upon the practice, traces of it endured in places where fertility cults flourished. Women, sold or dedicated to the gods, were made to serve in this way, their bodies treated as offerings. Their prices were high, their roles cloaked in religious justification, but their autonomy was none. The paradox of temple slavery was sharp. In theory, the sacred world was separate from the profane. Priests stood as mediators between mortals and gods. Yet even here, the institution of slavery intruded. A slave could light incense but not pray freely. He could dress a statue of Jupiter but not control his own life. He could sing hymns to the gods but never ask them for his own liberation. The temple, like the household and the latifundia, was built on chains. For the Romans, this was not contradiction. It was order. The gods themselves were imagined as masters, Rome as their servant. Slavery was embedded in the very language of piety. To serve was divine. To be obedient was holy. Slaves in temples embodied this idea literally, their labor a constant reminder that Rome's hierarchy stretched from heaven to earth. And yet, there are stories of slaves finding quiet dignity in this service. A boy who sang hymns each morning, his voice echoing against marble, may have felt pride in his role even if it was forced. A girl who lit lamps before the statue of Vesta may have whispered her own secret prayers. Some temple slaves were freed after years of service, manumitted by priests or by grateful patrons. Their names occasionally appear in inscriptions, dedicating altars themselves, once servants of gods, later citizens who could finally worship freely. Economically, the temple system shows how slavery infiltrated every corner of Roman life. Temples owned land, and that land was worked by slaves. They collected offerings, maintained treasuries, and often lent money, wealth managed, guarded, and multiplied by enslaved labor. The gods in Rome had their own estates, their own accounts, their own servants. A temple could rival a noble household in size, wealth, and dependence on the enslaved. How much did Roman slaves cost? In temples, the answer was layered. Some were worth thousands, purchased for their beauty, their voices, their ritual skills. Others were cheap, tasked with sweeping floors and carrying water, but in every case their price was bound not only to human masters, but to divine service. They belonged not just to a man, but to the gods, or so Rome declared. At dusk, as lamps were lit in sanctuaries, temple slaves moved quietly through shadowed halls. Their footsteps echoed on marble, Their hands lifted incense, their voices rose in chants. Worshippers knelt, prayed, and departed, never seeing the labor that made the sacred shine. The gods received their offerings, the priests their honors, Rome its reassurance. The slaves remained, cleaning, carrying, preparing for tomorrow's rituals. For Rome, their service was piety. For the slaves, it was another kind of chain. For centuries, Rome's markets had overflowed with captives. Every war brought thousands, every rebellion crushed, every province subdued, every frontier pushed farther. The flow of slaves was as steady as the Tiber itself. They poured into docks at Delos, Carthage, and Ostia. They filled the auction blocks of the Forum. Rome never doubted the supply. But empires change, and even Rome's hunger could not last forever. By the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE, the tide began to ebb. Conquest slowed. The great age of expansion, the wars of Caesar, Pompey, Augustus, was gone. Rome now defended more than it conquered. Fewer wars meant fewer captives, and fewer captives meant fewer slaves. The markets that once thundered with coin and cries grew quieter. Prices climbed. The cheap abundance of human labor, once taken for granted, began to vanish. This shift struck hardest at the latifundia, the great estates. For generations, their fields had been tilled by slaves captured in foreign wars. Now, owners faced shortages. A farmhand once bought for 400 sesterces might now cost 800, 1,000, or more. To maintain estates, landowners turned to new strategies. Some relied on free tenant farmers, colony, who worked land in exchange for a share of the harvest. Others encouraged their slaves to raise families, hoping to breed new generations of laborers. What had once been a simple purchase became a long-term calculation. The decline also changed the nature of the slave trade itself. Instead of vast auctions of war captives, markets increasingly depended on smaller streams. Piracy, raids on the edges of empire, children sold by desperate families. These were less predictable, more dangerous, and often more expensive. The steady rhythm of supply gave way to uncertain trickles. Rome's machine, once fed by conquest, now survived on scraps. In urban households, the effects were subtler but real. Skilled slaves, cooks, scribes, tutors, grew rarer. Their prices, already high, rose to new heights. A Greek tutor who once cost 10,000 sesterces might now be worth double. Wealthy families still paid, but the middle ranks of society struggled. Freedmen, who had once relied on buying slaves to staff workshops and businesses, now turned increasingly to hired free labor. The balance between slavery and wage work began to shift. This was not the end of slavery, far from it. Millions remained in bondage across the empire. But the decline in supply made the institution less invisible. Where once slaves were abundant, now they were precious. Where once a master might discard a worker casually, now he thought twice. Even cruelty bent under the pressure of scarcity. Some owners treated slaves with greater care, not out of mercy, but because replacement was costly. Economics, not morality, softened the whip. The state too felt the change. Rome's legions, once fueled by loot and captives, now strained the treasury. Without endless conquest to fund them, the cost of soldiers grew heavier. Slaves had been the silent spoils of war, their sale filling private coffers and sustaining estates. Now their absence left gaps that money alone could not fill. The empire tightened its grip on taxes, squeezing provinces harder, while its social fabric quietly shifted. In this new world, the colony emerged as a symbol of transition. These tenant farmers were technically free, but bound to the land they worked, their obligations heavy, their autonomy limited. In time, their status would harden into something resembling serfdom, the system that defined medieval Europe. The decline of slaves gave rise to a new form of unfreedom, less visible but equally enduring. The marketplace reflected this transformation. Imagine standing in a provincial town in the 3rd century. The auctioneer still calls, the platform still creaks, the slaves still stand trembling. But the crowd is smaller, the prices climb higher, the buyers more cautious. A farmhand now represents a serious investment, a risk as well as an asset. Merchants complain of thin supply, masters grumble of rising costs. Scribes record the shift in ledgers. The great torrent has become a stream. For the slaves themselves, the decline brought no comfort. Scarcity did not mean freedom. If anything, it meant their masters clung tighter, guarding them as valuable property. Escape grew more difficult when replacements were rare. Families, encouraged to grow, found their children born into chains. The system endured, but its character changed. Less reckless, more calculating, always shaped by coin. Philosophers noticed the shift too. Some saw in it a sign that Rome's greatness was fading, that the empire had lost the momentum of conquest. Others argued it was natural, the balance of war and peace. Few, however, saw it as a reason to abandon slavery itself. Even in scarcity, the institution remained unquestioned, woven too deeply into Rome's fabric to unravel. How much did Roman slaves cost? In the late empire, the answer was simple: more than before. A cook who had once been a luxury became a treasure. A farmhand who had once been cheap became an investment. A tutor who had once been attainable only by the rich became almost priceless. The marketplace itself told the story of decline, not in silence, but in rising numbers, climbing prices, and anxious buyers. As twilight fell over the empire, the signs of change were everywhere. The market still rang with coin, but the sound was thinner. The estate still bustled, but with fewer hands. The household still served dinners, but with servants guarded more carefully. Rome remained vast, still powerful, but the easy abundance of the past was gone. The empire had grown too large, too strained, too tired. Its appetite had not diminished, but its supply had. Slavery did not end with this decline. It continued for centuries, shifting in form, adapting to need. But the great river that had once fed Rome slowed, and with it, the empire itself began to change. The cost of slaves was no longer just sesterces. It was the cost of decline, the price of empire turning from conquest to survival. For centuries, Rome recorded its slaves in numbers: a farmhand, 400 sesterces; a tutor, 10,000; a gladiator, 12,000. The ledgers spoke of profit and loss, purchase and sale, supply and demand. But beneath those tidy columns was another account, one Rome never wrote down. It was measured not in coin but in sorrow, the hidden human cost. Every slave sold at market left behind a story. A child torn from parents, a husband separated from his wife, a mother stripped of her infant. Auctions were not only transactions, they were fractures. A family arriving together in chains might be scattered within hours, each member sold to different masters, different towns, different fates. Rome did not count the tears shed on auction platforms. It counted only the silver that changed hands. The hidden cost began at capture. Soldiers stormed villages, setting fire to huts, seizing survivors. Those who resisted were killed. Those who remained were bound. Children clung to mothers until torn away. The march to the coast was long, brutal, and deadly. Some died along the way, their bodies abandoned. Others arrived weakened, only to be sold cheaply. For every healthy slave who fetched a good price, several had already paid with their lives unseen. In the slave quarters, the human cost continued. The barracks of farm slaves echoed with coughs in winter, with groans of exhaustion in summer. Malnutrition shortened lives. Women bore children only to see them claimed as property. Babies were assets, not sons or daughters. Rome's laws made no distinction. The womb itself was a factory of labor. Every child born into slavery, another line of profit in a master's account. But for the mothers, the cost was immeasurable. Their children never truly theirs. The emotional toll seeped into silence. Slaves sang songs in their native tongues, but only in whispers. They carved marks into walls, secret signs of identity. They carried memories of rivers, forests, and hills they would never see again. Rome erased their names, but it could not erase memory. That tension between erasure and remembrance was its own wound. There was also the cost of fear. A cook might tremble each time he brought a dish, knowing a single mistake could mean a beating. A maid might dread the master's footsteps, knowing what they might demand. A farmhand might sleep in chains, listening for the sound of dogs. Life itself was lived under threat, every hour shadowed by punishment. Rome saw obedience. The slave felt terror. And then there was the cost of time. A slave's life was measured in labor until death or manumission. Most never lived to see freedom. Years that could have been spent in family, in laughter, in peace, were instead consumed by toil. The hidden cost was not only pain but absence. Lives unlived, potential erased, joys stolen before they began. Some costs appeared only after freedom. A freedman might walk the streets of Rome with pride, but inside carried scars, physical and invisible. A manumitted nurse might live to see her former charge grown and powerful, yet never forget the years when her own children were sold away. Freedom could not return what chains had already taken, and yet the evidence lingers. In epitaphs carved by freedmen, love for lost family is etched in stone. To my beloved wife, torn from me too soon. In fragments of poetry, voices break through. Slaves described as loyal friends rather than tools. In archaeology, children's toys found in slave quarters whisper of innocence bound in chains. These remnants reveal the cost Rome tried to hide. How much did Roman slaves cost? The market said 200, 400, 10,000 sesterces. But the hidden cost was born in human lives, in mothers' arms emptied, in backs scarred, in voices silenced. The empire did not count those numbers, but history feels them still. Imagine for a moment standing in the forum as an auction unfolds. The crowd cheers, the coins clink, the auctioneer calls. But listen closer. Beneath the noise is the sound of quiet sobbing, the gasp of a child reaching for a parent, the dull silence of someone too numb to cry. Those sounds were the true ledger, written not in wax but in flesh. At night, in the slave quarters, the cost became visible in the smallest acts. A mother rocking another's child as if it were her own. A man sharing half his bread with a weaker companion. A song hummed softly to remember a homeland. These were the ways the enslaved paid their hidden debt, not with coin, but with resilience. Rome's monuments still stand. Its roads still stretch across Europe. Its aqueducts still arch against the sky. They are hailed as triumphs of civilization. But each stone was laid with hands that bled, each road paved with footsteps that never walked home again. The true cost of Rome's greatness was not marble or bronze, it was human. Rome's empire fell, but its shadows never vanished. The Colosseum crumbled, emperors faded into memory, the legions dissolved. Yet the chains remained, not literally, but in echoes that stretched across centuries. The system Rome perfected, the idea that a human life could be priced, bought, and owned, did not die with the empire. It lingered, reshaping the world long after Rome's marble turned to ruin. The echoes began in law. Roman slavery had been codified with precision. Rules for manumission, contracts of sale, punishments for fugitives. These laws did not disappear with Rome. They were copied, adapted, woven into the legal traditions of medieval Europe. The very concept of property and people, what it meant to own another human, was sharpened by Roman precedent. Even as Europe shifted towards serfdom, the memory of Rome's slave system gave structure to new forms of unfreedom. In language, too, the echoes survived. The Latin word servus, slave, gave rise to words in many European tongues: serf, servant, service. The very vocabulary of duty and obedience carried Rome's imprint. To serve was no longer simply an act, it was an identity shaped by centuries of Roman practice. Even today, when we speak of servitude, we speak with Roman echoes. But the most powerful echo was in imagination. Rome's example stood as a model of empire, its triumphs admired, its cruelties rationalized. When later powers sought to build their own empires, they looked back to Rome. The Spanish in the Americas, the Portuguese on the African coast, the British across the seas, all inherited, consciously or not, Rome's view that domination was natural, that conquest produced captives, and that captives could be made into property. The transatlantic slave trade, centuries later, carried Rome's shadow across oceans. Ships filled with chained men and women echoed the Roman galleys that once ferried captives from Gaul or Africa to Italy. Auction blocks in Charleston or Havana echoed the marketplaces of the Forum. Ledgers in London and Lisbon, calculating profit and loss in human lives, echoed the wax tablets of Roman accountants. The numbers were larger, the distances greater, but the logic was the same. Even in culture, Rome's slavery lingered. The romanticized gladiator, fighting in sand for freedom, became a symbol retold in plays, novels, and films. Spartacus, executed along the Appian Way, rose again as a hero for ages that came after. His rebellion inspired not only art but politics, invoked by revolutionaries, abolitionists, and dreamers who saw in his defiance the eternal cry for freedom. Rome's chains rattled still, not in oppression, but in resistance remembered. Yet the echoes were not only broad, they were intimate. In medieval Europe, the structure of households, the servants, the stewards, the cooks, the maids, mirrored Rome's domestic slaves. The great estates of the Middle Ages, worked by serfs bound to the land, resembled Rome's latifundia, only with subtler chains. Even the idea of inherited bondage, that a child could be born unfree because of the status of the mother, was Roman law, carried forward through centuries. Rome also left behind an enduring contradiction, the idea that civilization and slavery could coexist. The empire was admired for its law, art, architecture, and literature, but all of it was built on bondage. Later societies inherited not only Rome's roads and aqueducts, but also its justification, that greatness excused cruelty, that luxury required labor, that some lives could be sacrificed for the many. This contradiction haunted every later empire, a moral debt passed down like inheritance. The echoes reached even into religion. Early Christianity was born within Rome's slave society. The language of servitude filled its scriptures, to be a slave of Christ, to serve God as master. Paul's letters advise slaves to obey, even as the faith preached spiritual freedom. The metaphor shaped theology for centuries, its double edge both comforting and dangerous. Rome's institutions shaped the very words of salvation. How much did Roman slaves cost? The question does not end in Rome, it travels forward. In the Middle Ages, peasants bound to land paid their lords not with coin, but with labor, an echo of Roman fields. In the early modern world, Africans sold on Atlantic shores were priced in pounds and dollars, an echo of Roman auctions. Even today, when we speak of human trafficking, of forced labor in unseen corners of the world, we hear faintly the same arithmetic Rome once perfected. People reduced to numbers. And yet the echoes also carried hope. The stories of resistance, of Spartacus, of slaves who bought their freedom, of those who endured with dignity, were remembered, retold, and used as weapons against later systems of oppression. Abolitionists cited Rome's cruelties to condemn their own societies. Revolutionaries invoked its rebels as symbols of defiance. Rome taught the world not only how to chain, but also how to resist chains. Standing in the ruins of the Forum today, it is easy to admire the marble, the arches, the pillars. But listen closely, and you can almost hear the other sound. The murmur of markets, the cries of captives, the coins clinking into purses. That sound traveled far beyond Rome, carried across centuries, shaping worlds that claimed to be new, but carried Rome's old burden. Rome's empire is gone. Its chains remain, not on wrists, but in memory, in law, in echoes that still shape how we think of power, wealth, and freedom. The true cost of Roman slavery was not paid in sesterces. It was paid in centuries of repetition, in the inheritance of systems that turned people into property again and again.